In this episode, I am joined by Alex W., long-term practitioner of Zen, Pragmatic Dharma, and Western Occultism. Alex describes his journey from elite upbringing in Geneva through NeoPlatonism, Zen practice, and magic to advanced states of spiritual attainment and insight. Alex tells stories of his discipleships under Pragmatic Dharma teacher Kenneth Folk and renowned occultist Alan Chapman, and details the lead up to and attainment and after effects of his own experience of enlightenment. Alex recounts his successful operation of the Abramelin Ritual, a powerful kundalini awakening, and his ongoing encounters with spiritual beings such as Kālī Mā and Hecate. So without further ado, Alex W. Welcome to the podcast.
Good evening, Steve. Nice to see you here. Thank you.
Well, I'm so pleased to finally be talking to you. We've had ongoing dialogue off air, so to speak, for quite some time. And I've often attempted to coax you into an interview, and finally you agreed. So I'm very pleased that you've done so. And yes, so here we are.
You are. It's right. Yeah, you have been tempted before to hit the record button. I sort of slowed you down because I was not interested in becoming too public or on that matter, because I'm not a teacher. I'm not an author. I'm not promoting anything. But I like to share with like-minded individuals.
And I'm curious, in that case, what it was that led you to decide to say yes to the interview after my many invitations.
I think we'll get there towards the end of the story, because that's connected to something that happened sort of recently.
Okay, great. Well, in that case, let's not start at the end. Let's start at the beginning.
I will answer, but yeah, it has to come at the right moment, in the proper context.
So let's start at the beginning then, at the very beginning. I wonder if you might say something about your upbringing, your family of origin, and that.
Yeah, family origin. So I was born close to Geneva in the French-speaking part of Switzerland, in a family of the sort of middle upper class, more like intellectual bourgeoisie type of thing. You know, my father has a PhD in chemistry, worked for the pharmaceutical industry. My mother had many jobs as a kind of assistant of some directors or CEOs. And she's the daughter of a journalist that lived for 25 years in Paris. So she was very much interested into international relation, and she worked actually for the World Economic Forum, you know, the famous Davos, and people talking about the Great Reset and all that. I mean, these people were the kind of people invited for dinner at home, you know, back then when I was a kid. So I was kind of brought up in an environment of scientists, journalists, diplomats, that kind of people. And I grew up in that part of Switzerland. When I was 15 years old, I spent a year in America, in New Mexico, Albuquerque, close to Albuquerque, which was a very interesting experience. Living in a completely different environment at an early age, actually, and I didn't speak English at all, almost. So it was quite interesting. And there in America was, because my parents were not interested in anything really religious or something. I mean, my mother kind of was. I had also, like, her own mother has Brazilian origins, so that's the kind of sort of spiritual, this kind of folk Catholic witchy side of the family, if you will. But otherwise, my parents were not like religious or going to any church or something. My father has a kind of vague interest in like Taoism and Zen, but more in relation with art, like Jackson Pollock and all these artist of the 1960s, 70s. And so in America, suddenly I was into this kind of Baptist church type of environment with these Bible studies and stuff. And for me, actually, compared to many Americans that have been traumatized by their religious upbringing in these kind of environments, I found it very interesting because I started to study, the Bible and to think about all these issues, maybe from more philosophical, maybe point of view, or metaphysical, more than religious as such. And when I came back, I had to go for a very big kind of surgery of the back because my spine wasn't straight. And that suddenly put me in, like you are this kind of teenager, just interested in your first like love stories and going to concerts and parties and stuff. And suddenly you go for a surgery for 10 hours in a row, and you think that you maybe never wake up or that you may be paralyzed or something. I mean, back then it was not that, such a small thing. So that also confronted me to suddenly the idea that I'm not that eternal. And so I think that played an important role. And then when I was in the hospital, before coming back also, you start to see also who are your real friends that come to see you, who pretend to be but don't really care about you and all that. And this sort of gradually, I think it didn't take too much time, put me in a kind of spiritual quest in a way. I was more interested into understanding what was the meaning of life, what happened after death, all these things become something that obsessed me in a way. And I had also friends all the time, always elder than me. Like when I was 17, they were 24 or something. And some of them did a lot of LSD, and it was the kind of gothic punk time back then in the late 80s. We did the Camden Palace in London. That was the kind of places back then. So all these people have been into drugs and all kind of crazy things. And I was not interested in drugs themselves, but trying to sort of replicate or to access altered states by natural means. So that got me interested into meditation and philosophy and spirituality in general. This led me eventually, after divorce of my parents, with my mother and sister, to join a kind of Hindu religious group. I eventually actually lived in a kind of shared house with Indian people. And there I learned a lot about, not only about Hinduism, but many other religions, and actually learn. Yeah, I mean, what I find interesting, I think, in Hinduism is that it's a pagan tradition that goes back thousands of years ago, and that in a way adapts very well to the modern world. And that's unbroken. That's unbroken with Brahmins and people that recite the same Rig Veda since thousands of years, and so I found this quite fascinating, and to see also that Hinduism is a kind of cousin of our European pre-Christian religious traditions. Not so much, I would say, modern Hinduism, but the pure Vedic, Indra that we find with Zeus, Jupiter, Thor, that have a similar, thunder and fighting a dragon and this kind of thing. It's very similar myth and similar religious environment. So the group itself became sort of cultish, but I met many people. I traveled to India. I lived in a Hindu environment. That's why I'm very much at ease when I'm talk later about Bali and all that. That's kind of natural. So many people like grew up in a Christian environment. I'm more like grew up in a Hindu environment, basically. And I really believed in it. Like, you know, it was not some kind of, no, it's just the mind and some kind of archetypes. No, I really believed in it. So eventually I left because I was not interested by all this kind of politics and guru worship and things that, you know, a lot of people, that's the problem often with the Indian stuff. But it's where also I had my first spiritual experiences, and often when I sort of left the place where I was supposed to be and went with like one or two friends to some small temple in a small village on the beach just south of Bombay and all that, and coming back suddenly feeling just one with the ocean, one with the birds, you know, this kind of feeling where for like 2 or 3 hours we felt completely merged with nature. And so yeah, that kind of thing. And I got an interest for, I mean, there's something I would say, it can sound cliche, but there are places in India where just and that's where I find often in many countries, it's not the temples, it's not the people, it's just like you go out and suddenly you are in the countryside, away from civilization, away from anything supposed to be spiritual, whatever, and there you find spirit, you know. So that's what I saw in India. But the land is charged. There is something about it. So eventually I left all this. I was in university, in law school. I was very much then into philosophy. I read, I think like everything, from Nietzsche and around Nietzsche. That was the way for me to deconstruct religion in a way. But also that led me logically to Heidegger, and from Heidegger to the Kyoto School, Nishida and these people. So I was like 23 or something, but I was really into this kind of thing. And the logic then was to go into Zen Buddhism, not so much for the religious thing, but as a kind of logical conclusion of Heidegger and Nishida, as a practice of their philosophy in a way, you know. But also in law school, I tried to go from a master's degree in law towards a PhD in philosophy. And the way to branch that was so philosophy, I mean, the way it's called in Switzerland is different than the British American system, but through like philosophy of law or history of political ideas, that's the kind of thing that can allow you to branch from one to another. And the professor actually liked law students because he considered that we had this kind of very sort of logical mind. And it was pretty hard, you know, with like law and medicine were used to be the most difficult in Geneva. So he wanted like serious students. So like at the beginning we were like 20 something students, and then just like 4 or something after a few months. And he was a specialist of medieval philosophy, and I found it absolutely fascinating because we went through like Duns Scott, Thomas Aquinas, Suarez, I mean, all these authors. And like we have this kind of Hollywood idea of the Dark Age and the Middle Ages where people are very backward. And actually you realize that it's just the opposite. I mean, like the intellectual power of these people has nothing to do with modern philosophers nowadays, you know. That's really, because the elite back then, you know, nowadays, like the brightest people, they would go to work for Goldman Sachs or BlackRock or something, or I don't know, like some engineers for like Elon Musk or something. But back then, they were like monks and professors of these first European universities, and and the whole politics of the Middle East also is very complex. You've got the empire, the local kings, the church, the different orders, and in order to get your way for some pretty down to earth political things, you needed to argue with through metaphysics. And therefore, it also pushed people to go very far into that, you know. So I found it absolutely fascinating. And that professor would actually, like, he would read for us something like in French from Aristotle, and then you would see the book he was reading, and he was reading in ancient Greek and translating, and he was reading, you know. So this kind of really impressive people. So that was it, yeah. And then I got involved into Zen Buddhism, the kind of Soto Zen, in Geneva with a group of the people around Deshimaru before, who was a kind of Japanese Soto pseudo monk who became very famous in Paris in the late 60s, I think, or early 70s, and started sort of Zen in continental Europe. But then I didn't really, I like to practice. And I would say, actually, I think it's one of the best things people can do to get started with meditation. I mean, just like to learn to just, what you can do for 4 hours that I can't do like you, but like sitting still without moving a finger for at least 45 minutes, an hour, you know. As you know, that's painful in the beginning, but then when you commit to it, you really gain something for life. And any other practice becomes much easier after that, sorry. And I see nowadays, like, there are people who ask me to teach them this and that. And so I tell them, like, do you have like at least half an hour a day to commit to it? Otherwise, no use, waste of my time. You know? And they say, yeah, sure. And then a few days later, they say, okay, but you know, like, can I start with like 5 minutes because I've got ADHD or something? I say, okay, I don't know, but it's like, you know, just like learn to just sit before trying to do any other practice later. And that's the way they do things. That's the way they do it in China, I saw. And I think in Japan, they just ask people to sit. They don't teach them anything else. And so anyway, so I thought that was the best thing for me to really get the discipline to commit to a practice in a very strict, formal, and also I sort of liked back then this kind of super kind of manly style of spirituality, you know, because there was not much religious stuff, not much politics, not much, just like you sit, you know, you sit and you just practice. Okay. But then I wanted to be connected to the real Sotoshu of Japan. So actually with two friends, one was a former like banker, like he started Citibank in Geneva and he was the head of a huge commodities trading company. I mean, it's like big guy. The other one was a musician playing counterbass in a Philharmonic orchestra. So kind of, yeah, interesting people. And we got in touch with this priest from Sendai in North Japan. That started because he knew also some people in Bern through somebody's wife. And we started organizing sessions, so this week of meditation, of intense Zen meditation, in the Bern Oberland, so it's the Alps, close to Bern, the capital of Switzerland, which is very beautiful. And that was really interesting because that was the real Zen guy. In a sense, like his grandfather or grand-grandfather was a samurai, and then when they ended, you know, there was the Meiji Restoration and all that, and they forbid people from having weapons with them and all this. And I think that his ancestor became a Zen priest of this particular temple in Sendai. And then you have like generations, because in Japan, people don't always understand. People call like Zen monk. They're not monks anymore. They are more like pastors. You know, they are married, they have kids, and it's a kind of family business that they pass from father to son. And when somebody doesn't have a son, then they try to marry their daughter with somebody who can take over. So that's how the way it works. And in Japan, Zen is more a kind of it's a death business, basically. Japan is very interesting for that, and I think many people in the West don't know much about real Japanese Zen, basically, because they got like some part of Zen from some kind of like the Sasanbo Kyodan, which is a kind of small minority, kind of new religious movement in Japan. They see it as a kind of cult that is more or less the basis of 90% of like North American Zen and all that. But the real Zen of Japan is mostly focused. I mean, they have their own practice. But the business of having a temple, it's mostly doing funerals, ceremonies for people. Because if you have people part of your parish, by analogy, that work for some big corporation, when the people pass away and you do the ceremony, you will get paid from Mitsubishi Bank, from Sony, from all these big corporations, and that's a lot of money. So those people are quite wealthy, actually. Like they drive a big Lexus and they have all this silk, and like Buddhism in Japan is a kind of, it's not like what I saw later in other Asian countries, however, there is something also that I noticed in Japan, maybe especially in North Japan, is that's something you may have noticed with Japanese people, is that they have their kind of outside appearance that's very sort of Americanized, modern. So if you ask them, they would say like they don't really believe, or they will give you some kind of very down-to-earth, rational, materialistic explanation of their practice or their religion, not only about Zen, about any kind of Buddhist or Shinto or whatever, but inside they have their own deep, ancient Japanese mind, and they are very religious. And that's something also people don't really understand. They see those practices as being sort of very dry, almost atheistic, and it's not the case in Japan. I mean, they have like these temples with all these kamis, because the Zen temples, especially in North Japan in Kyoto School, were based on some Shingon temples before. Like Shingon temples became Zen. And before that, they were often Shinto sanctuaries. And therefore, once a year, the priest has to do the rituals to all the kami of the Shinto sort of jinja that's actually at the origin there, and then all the tantric practices. So they know that they can do all these tantric rituals, and then you have the Zen part on top of it. So the whole history of the temple has to be reactivated once a year. So I discovered that part of Japan that I find very interesting, and for them, that's something very intimate. That's something they normally don't talk about. Like many things, it's like they have their private, intimate inner culture, and then what they show to outsiders, what they talk about, even to anthropologists. And okay, so that's for the part. But at that time also, because I was planning to actually work for a few years in Japan, and Japan was still kind of very like leading economic country, and there were more opportunities for expats. But then came the, I think, 1996 financial crisis around Thailand, the baht, and then it rippled, and the whole Japanese banking system crashed, and it became difficult to actually find a job as expat there, and I didn't work for a big corporation. I was just like freshly graduated from law school, and I could, I need to explain also is that I could not finish this whole PhD because I didn't have money, basically. So I had to work, and I did my internship in law practice and all that, and then also at the time was the beginning of the internet, and that changed everything, because I think like younger people in the audience don't even know what it is, what it used to be without the internet, without, not mentioning without the cell phone, but without the internet itself. So back then, I mean, like, there were few books, there were no self-published books. So in order to be published, I mean, all these big publishers, they would take like maybe 1 or 2 new author a year. There were not so many books about these things. And then you need to join organizations and then get into the politics and the stuff around it. So that was complicated. But then the internet changed everything, because suddenly I had these friends on, what was it called? AOL online or something. And that's the ancestor of the messenger, actually, that goes with Facebook. That was the AOL messenger or something. And that was amazing, because I could suddenly get in touch with people, some American people, that had been involved in Zen since the early 1960s, and their knowledge was just amazing. And so I discovered this guy who was married to, his wife was a professor at Emory University, and through his wife he could access all the PhD dissertations, all the hard to find books and stuff. And I learned so many things from him about Buddhism and Zen and Chinese philosophy via the early internet. And I actually met him in Atlanta later. And he sort of got me interested in Chinese Zen, Chan. And also at that time, I actually met a Chinese woman who became my wife. So we've been married for 26 years now. And that gave me the opportunity to travel to China. And because she had family in China, we could not often go further than China, because then I had to go back, for work. So I didn't get much chance to connect with Japan and to really sort of have a kind of career in Japanese Zen. However, that sort of opened for me the world of Chinese religion in general, and Chan more specifically. In a context, like I recall, like I visited some of these temples in the late 1990s that were, like nowadays, when I go to China, those temples are huge. You've got like thousands of people going there on a weekend. Back then, it wasn't the case. Like I was one of the only person visiting, and there were just a few monks there, and we could chat and talk about. So they would just like invite you for tea, and we would stay there for like 3 hours. And my wife worked as an interpreter for me, and sometimes I had to use Sanskrit words because she didn't know how to. There's a special vocabulary about like modern words in Chinese that have different meaning than they could have in the religious context. But it was very interesting because I met all these young monks in China that were, and they had a kind of missing link, because the last great masters left China during the Cultural Revolution or died. And some passed away in aged house in Hong Kong or in Taipei, in some of these places. And then there's been a gap of like 25, a generation basically. So you had all these young monks, and they were training in Korea. And that I found very interesting, because in the history of Chan, there's a moment where Matsu, one of the great masters of the Linji, ancestor of the Linji lineage, which is the main one in China, Rinzai in Japan. He had a disciple from Korea, and the Chinese disciple was saying, well, why don't you pass your lineage to this foreigner, this barbarian from Korea, you know. And he told them, because one day Chan will come back to China through Korea. And that's what happened actually in the 90s. So I found it interesting. And because also to explain, I take a bit of time to explain this, I think, because it's important for people to understand that Japan is very different from China and Korea, in the sense that there is no such thing really as a Zen monk. In China and Korea, you are a Buddhist monk. You follow the Vinaya. You are just a monk, and you are a real monk. I mean, they follow more rules than the monks of Thailand because they have some extra rules of Mahayana and stuff on top of the Vinaya of Southeast Asian monks. So they are real monks. They don't marry. They don't touch a woman. They don't, and while in Japan, from the Meiji Restoration, there was this big campaign against Buddhism where they forced basically monks to marry and to disrobe and to take a lay life. And therefore, there are no real monks in Japan anymore. And even before that, like Dogen, and they just received the Bodhisattva vows, but they were not fully ordained. And this is why later in the Kyoto School, and as well as in the Rinzai, it's through the Obaku Zen, which is the third sort of minority of Zen in Japan, that people got real ordinations, because it came from China in the Ming Dynasty, and they had a real full ordination. So anyway, so Japanese Buddhism is something very specific that organizes itself around sectarian schools that each have their own single practice, like Nichiren Shu, Jodo Shu, Joshin Shu, Rinzai Shu, and all that. But it's not at all like China and Korea, where everybody's just a monk. And then, according to whose teacher you have, you may inherit a lineage from Pure Land or Zen Chan or something like that. Okay. Anyway, I could speak for hours about these things, but I think it's not related to me anyway. So, moving forward, I've been into Zen for like 15 years. But I was reaching a kind of plateau. So I went to all these seishin and these big practices, also temples in Italy. And I kind of liked this kind of monastic life for a while, but I was not made for that. I couldn't live as a monk, I think, because I don't like this kind of military type of, especially Japanese is very kind of military. I like more the kind of freedom, of more like a kind of Taoist hermit or somebody just married like me, just married and doing a kind of everyday life and having his own practice in private. So that was for Zen. And then now we move forward to the interesting stuff connected to some of the people that you have interviewed in the past. So fast forward to 2010, because I read a lot of books, including also about like Western occultism and all this kind of thing. And suddenly I see a book called Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha by some Daniel Ingram, and some people saying, who's that guy boasting to be some kind of what's that? When everybody criticizes somebody else, some work, I suddenly find it interesting somehow. I'm a kind of snobbish person. Like, if everybody likes a movie, I wait 5 years to see it, And if everybody's against something, I say, maybe there's something interesting about it. So I checked the book, I bought it, and I found it fascinating, absolutely fascinating, because we had somebody that had such a deep mastery of these Buddhist practices, and that described everything with such detail. I mean, I was just like fascinated. And then I realized that the guy actually had a forum, which was the Dharma Overground back then. And then on the forum itself, you had such amazing people. Amazing people. And some of them became sort of famous later, And so I sort of quickly made friend with Kenneth Folk. That was not mentioned in the book itself. There's allusions to him, but his name is not mentioned because he didn't want to be part of it, because he was teaching in some mainstream famous Buddhist place and didn't want to be involved with it, knowing that it would bring some controversy. And Kenneth Folk was actually trying to start his own career as a teacher, I think, and therefore he sort of invited me to his own little platform, and very generously taught me the jhanas, the access to these meditative states. I try to avoid being too technical because not everybody's familiar with these things, but these are basically some deep states of absorption that are very interesting because it's very technical and it's very like there's a kind of very simple in a way one we can access. Most difficult is to access the first one, and then you just have to slightly move your focus to get to the second, the third, the fourth, and then you extend to infinite space, infinite consciousness. I mean, it's like playing music. After a while, you become able to rise and go back down and move from first to second and then jump to fifth. I mean, it's pretty geeky in a way also, but it shows how we can actually access those altered states and in a way that's quite fascinating, I would say. Yeah, fascinating. And what I noticed with it is that, first of all, because I had some kind of energy blockage, and going through these kind of very ecstatic states, what it does is that it opens the energy channels in some way. And also, like some of these jhanas, like when you feel this kind of sense of absolute joy, love, peace, it sort of settles your nervous system in a way. I mean, it's very healthy actually for the whole energy body too. But the most interesting thing with it is that when you exit those states, and even if you're not very deeply into them, because I would never qualify according to some of the hardcore, people in Burma or something, they would say, no, you're not even a jhana. But anyway, I just loved it. And when you exit from such state, your mind is so clear that Vipassana takes a whole new dimension. I mean, it's not anymore the kind of scanning and getting bored and itchy here and you want to scratch. And no, it's like your whole body starts like feeling like a field of electromagnetic energy, and then the thing dissolves, and it's like it gets really crazy. And so he went through that, and then I think Kenneth used our email discussion to sort of advertise his teaching style, and that's how it started his career in a way. And I was actually in China at the time, and they were all talking Mandarin, and I'm not that good at it, so I was sometimes out of discussions, like family stuff. So I would have time to meditate and to actually stay in. So what Kenneth Folk did is to ask me to reach this kind of state of infinite consciousness and try to keep it during everyday life. So you sort of attune to this feeling of being this kind of very broad consciousness within everyday life as a kind of like witness state, maybe of some Advaita, type practices. And I came back from China and I was meditating at home. And then I was in that state and I tried to see the observer, like, where is this observer in my head, So I was trying to, is it there? And then every time you sort of know it's like here, but it can't be here, So I was playing with this for a while, and suddenly it vanished, like as if it disappeared. I was like, where the hell am I? Like the sense of self completely vanished, and I was nothing and everything at the same time. And whatever I looked was me looking at myself, this kind of non-dual thing. And suddenly quite a big part of what Zen is talking about started to make full sense, because that's what they're talking about, basically. I mean, one of these, at least early kind of spirits of non-duality. So I was there like, whoa, that's the real Zen Chan, you know. That's how it works. So, and around that time, on this particular forum, this Dharma Overground of, I started, I think that's what I was in China, yeah, with a young British, he was like 32, 34, British young man. I was more like 39 or something, 38, 39. British, traveling across the world, and he started asking me questions because he was in India, and he was asking me about the connections between Advaita Vedanta and Buddhism. So I explained to him that actually the teacher of Adi Shankaracharya, who's, yeah, as you know, the founder of the Advaita Vedanta, the way we know it now, and the big reformer, actually, all the orthodox orders of sadhus go back to Adi Shankaracharya. His own teacher, Gaudapada, was accused of being a crypto-Buddhist back then at this time because he took a lot from Madhyamika and Yogacara Buddhism philosophy. So it's also something that Hindus and Buddhists don't understand, is that because they only know their world and they don't realize that actually the Hinduism of the time of Buddha Sakyamuni had nothing to do with the modern or even that of the 8th or 7th century, and that Advaita Vedanta actually took a lot from Buddhist philosophy. And early Buddhism, in my opinion, takes a lot from Samkhya. I think that the Abhidharma actually is a kind of psychological, empirical, descriptive, workable description based on the metaphysics of Samkhya, basically. But anyway, it would be too long to argue about it. So anyway, we had this kind of philosophical discussion, and we started to sort of make friends around that, but it's kind of the way the guys meet sometimes, like around some very kind of abstract philosophical discussions and stuff. And gradually, I understand that he sort of found enlightenment somewhere in Arunachala, where Ramana Maharshi lives in South India, and that he's traveling around the world with his new wife on their honeymoon, and that he's from London, and that actually he's a member of a well-known sort of occult group of chaos magic and all that. And the guy was Alan Chapman, who you interviewed, I think, twice at least. Duncan Barford, both of them had their podcast back then called The Baptist Head. And so that was at the time where they had completed their quest, sort of, and Alan was traveling the world. And what brought us together is that Alan started commenting Dogen, the Japanese founder of the Soto Zen, especially the first part of the Genjo Kwan, which is a famous essay from Dogen, a very deep description of the enlightened state. And Alan's take on it, unfortunately, I don't have it anymore. I don't know, it's not anymore. The website does not exist anymore, but was, in my opinion, better than everything that I read from official Zen authorities, and all that. So I was just like fascinated by this guy, and we shared many common interests, and therefore I sort of begged him in a way to become his student. And Alan was like, what the hell, like, what do you? I'm not a teacher. I'm like, I've been coaching somebody but the guy left for some Mongolia someplace, and I was seeing. And he had to think about it for like 3 days or something. And I insisted. It was funny. And then he said, okay, yeah. So actually, if people know Alan Chapman or heard some of his videos on YouTube, he often mentions this Zen. He calls me like Zen priest or Zen guy, which I was ordained in Japanese orthodox, but I was not a priestess. but I'm the one, I'm the guy who actually kickstarted his career out of the blue because I was just fascinated by this guy who sort of understood better than anybody else the sort of founder of the branch of Zen that I've been following. And so we met in London. And the guy surprised me because he's so simple, so ordinary. We met at Watkins, and like just the opposite of all these occultists and stuff. But the guy was quite a big, like a well-known figure in the world of the sort of hardcore occult stuff also back then, like the IoT and all this in London. So I forgot exactly. We were there, then went to a pub, then he brought me to his flat, and then he made me scry the Enochian Ether. So here we go into something completely different. So I talk about Zen, that was my main practice, but I had some interest also for Western occultism, and so I was familiar with some of this stuff, but I didn't know how to scry. I didn't know, all this thing was sort of new to me. I know the theory, and I said, I don't know how to do that. And he said, just try. The best way to do it is to do it. So I won't go into the details because I think it would be too long. It's not interesting. It's not the time, I think, to explain what is Enochian magic and all that. But basically, it's some kind of sort of, we could say, channeled material from John Dee and his scribe Edward Kelly. And John Dee was the advisor and astrologer of the Queen Elizabeth I. One of the brightest mind of the time, and I think that's some of the most interesting material for people passing by London who visit the British Museum. You can see there's a whole section with all these scrying stone and books and stuff, and it's a whole language, and in this language you have some very sort of apocalyptic poems, and in this weird language called Enochian that doesn't sound like anything really known, and this thing is known to produce some very powerful effects, and I was like new to that, and it really worked. Like I started to have visions and stuff, and I wrote it down. First of all, it did not manifest as a whole like story. It was more like seeing one thing after the other. But I used a dictionary of symbols, and I realized that all the figures or the things that appeared to me had the same meaning of sort of resurrection or this kind of symbolic meaning. And so we started with that, and then he went to his occult group thing. I think they had a practice this evening or something. But I don't know if we saw each other like twice in London or something, because I also had we also went to some place with his wife. We had dinner and we had we became like good friends, straight away. And he started coaching me via email for like almost a year or 6 months. And so I started to have this vision. So I was into more this kind of Buddhist, and as I told you, I don't have much of a Christian upbringing. But then I started to have all these visions around taking place between what now would be Israel and Egypt, and with this kind of highly Christian symbolicism. It took place around the life of Christ in the Gospels, but with, very faithful to the Gospel, but with a very rich alchemical or sort of Gnostic symbolicism also, and completely out of the blue. I was not really into that. Which shows also how real and powerful this thing is, because somebody who's just like not at all into this kind of thing, suddenly you start to have this vision that gradually unfolded. So first it's like you see something, but gradually it turns into a full sort of like vivid dream or astral travel, and and I would stay for like 1 hour just completely some other worlds with some kind of crazy stories that sort of mimic my own, symbolically, my own development stage, as well as matching sometime the liturgical calendar, like there was the time of the resurrection of Christ that followed in a logical order the previous stories. And suddenly I realized, I turn on the TV and I see the Pope giving the Easter benediction, so it was just like, whoa. So that was very interesting. Now, at the same time also, I tried not to go too much into details. We could maybe later sometimes in case. I was listening recently to the interview that you did of Mary Shutan, yeah. And she talked about her sort of bad experience with the Abramelin operation, but I think she did it the way Aleister Crowley did. So we did that, but in a different way, just by prayer. So the idea to explain to people is from a grimoire, kind of Jewish sort of Christian, what is like 16th century or something, or 17th century grimoire that is based on there are different versions. So one is 6 months, one is 18 months devotion of like half seclusion and prayer to invoke one's holy guardian angel. And the purpose when one makes the contact with this angel is to gain the power to bind different spirits and demons and all that. Okay. And the first, I guess, modern person who actually did the practice was Aleister Crowley. We did that in Scotland, close to the Loch Ness. And that actually started the whole sort of prophetic life of Crowley. So that's something that became very important in the heritage of Aleister Crowley, the famous or infamous British magician, the late 19th century, early 20th century. And but the way we did it was not the kind of Aleister Crowley kind of magical ritual. No, we sort of by the book, not by the book in the sense of having this kind of very complicated separate house and stuff, but in the sense of having the kind of pure, kind of almost naive religious attitude of praying one's guardian angel in a very sort of religious, humble way. We first use a kind of magical sigil. It's a kind of way to manifest the name, some kind of sacred name that would allow us to contact our angel. That's the only slightly magical part in the beginning. But then we use the methods of centering prayer. I don't know if you've heard of Father Keating, but basically the purpose is, it's based on the Cloud of Unknowing, one of the most interesting book of British mysticism. And one uses a sacred word that is used not as a mantra, like repeated rhythmically, but just as a kind of call of the heart that symbolizes our desire to, or intention to surrender to the divine will in a way. So here the meaning of this word was to call the angel, to invoke the angel, and to later to how to say that in English, to surrender, to let the angel actually accompany us, and it worked. And it worked. Like after, I swear to you, after like 2 weeks, so I was there like doing my thing like a very religious, like Jewish or Christian, with the Abramelin oil, anointing myself and the incense and the thing in this kind of very sort of religious, small, austere environment, praying on my knees. And after about 2 weeks, I started to have a dream and everything. And then one day, I feel the presence of holiness before me. Like, I don't know how to describe it, but sometimes if you go to some cathedral or some place, and there's no tourists, and suddenly you find a kind of religious feeling of something holy, you can relate to that. So it was the same feeling, but the kind of presence, kind of luminous, but not something like very visual, pretty abstract, but more like you feel some energy that that emanates this sense of purity, of holiness, and of unconditional love. And that's something I'd never experienced in the kind of Buddhist, because it's not the type of energy they are into, and that was something even destabilizing in a way, because I realized that what we call love as human beings is always conditional. Even our parents, it's always like, I love you if you are a good boy, if you are a good girl. You see what I mean? It's like always a kind of reward, punishment type of thing. So there was absolutely unconditional, the feeling that you're just loved as you are. I think people had these near-death experiences, may have experienced that kind of thing. I think they report something similar, like feeling some kind of real being loved just as they are in a totally unconditional way. So that was my first contact with the angel, okay? And from there, you gain the confidence that it's real. So then I use like different means, like tarot cards, like pendulum, like using my finger, to get guidance from this angel. And so that was not any kind of like witchcraft or magic, the way like people want to manifest some shit. No, it was like purely spiritual, devotional, and combined with this kind of Buddhist type meditation also, but focusing on this angel. And I thought that this kind of awakening, enlightenment, whatever we call it, that I was seeing as the purpose of my life and the thing that made me sacrifice a lot of things to go after this. I thought maybe it would happen in this life, maybe some other time, And suddenly I got through these means a kind of prophecy that would happen. I think like I did that in like January, and it says that would happen before June of the same year. And I was like, wow, I could not really believe that, but then it was confirmed by different means. And then the question became more, then what's the point of practice? And Alan was now I get to Alan because he's I don't want to speak too much about, I won't say anything private about him but he's a very skilled teacher, I must say. Very skilled. His way back then was to, of course, we were like following each other closely, so he could relate. He could see in me what was his own state 6 months before. But what he did is that he was more interested by seeing what I was obsessed with, and then encourage it in a way, and then push to the next thing. So he would, in the beginning, encourage some kind of wow experiences of some super cool states and stuff. And then he would start to poo-poo that, saying like, no, but we don't care about this. It's not about content. Like, forget this. And then he would gradually like push you to the next thing, the next challenge, but in a very kind of smart way, without saying too much, so I would write to him, I think once a week, my journal, or once a month, and then he would, like a kind of school teacher, he would send me back with some small notes. He's very kind of minimalistic, so it's just like to the point, very thoughtful. And he would say, okay, but why do you say that? Okay, that's good, very like short comments, and then he brought me to a place of this kind of, I think like Ken Wilber talks about that, the kind of like effort and grace moment where you realize that effort becomes counterproductive. And the more you try, the more you're stopping the process. And then you just don't know what to do. And then my conclusion with that is that the practice was just either the manifestation of my intent, or simply a kind of act of worship. So meditation was not anymore a means to an end, was just a way to celebrate, or something like that, this kind of idea. And then it came to a point where he started suddenly to push me into a kind of koan. And the thing was to tell me that everything that I'd experienced, and I went through all these jhanas and these stages of insight and these non-dual. And I thought that the purpose was to make this kind of non-dual thing that used to happen sort of every day, plus synchronicity, to make them sort of permanent. And it would click someday and I would be in that state forever and something. And he would say, nothing to do with it. It's like nothing to do with it. It's like, and he was using the metaphor saying, okay, like you're in a dream now and you're trying to awaken from the dream, but then realize that whatever you do in the dream is just doing something in a dream. So in a dream, you can do yoga, you can do meditation, you can do all kind of practices, all kind of shit. It won't change anything. It won't make you wake up. You're just doing stuff in the dream, and that won't wake you up from the dream, you know? So he was like playing with me on that, saying that I can't do anything about it. And whatever I was feeling good about or proud about or found cool or something was just like meaningless and stupid and useless. And at the same time, he was pushing me saying, do you really want that, you know? Or just you've been wasting like 20 years of your life chasing something that doesn't exist after all. So I was like pressed between these two forces of I really desire to get something, and then there's absolutely no way I can do anything to get it. And I got into this kind of fundamental koan of the Kyoto School, Nishida, and all that, which is if nothing will do, then what do you do? You know? And he got me into this koan at the right time. And I think that's the way also they would do it in China, is that they use koan in China only when it's normally, when it's the right time, people are ripe for it. If it's not the case, it's useless. You know, it's a tool for a particular moment. Otherwise, do something else. And so he used that at the right moment, and I got obsessed by the question. But it didn't last for so long. Like I found myself after 1 or 2 days in a state where the question was not even in my mind. I was just in this kind of, I could operate. I was scared. I would not be able to work or to drive or to, no, I could be normal apparently. I could work. I can do everything normally. But I was in a state of complete, like my mind was just like kind of crystal, you know, pure kind of meditative or whatever state nonstop for some time. And then he really sort of pressed me, and he can be a bit cruel when it's needed. And suddenly, because he was always saying it, but then what do you do? But then what do you do? But then, you know, and he was pressing. And at some point, I completely gave up. You know, I said, I don't know. And when I completely gave up trying to do anything, and then he said, then what's wrong with right now? And just this turning word, you know, like in the koan you read in these old stories, just this word. Suddenly, I looked around me and everything was spirit. And I was in this state where everything seemed to have shifted. So we said goodbye. I was like writing emails that everybody was out of the office, was like late. And I came back home in the bus and I was walking. There was no sense of agency. Like I was not doing anything. Life was happening. Okay. So, and it felt a bit strange. Like I would think like, do I look normal? But no one seemed to look at me like some kind of weirdo. So, okay. I went back home on a Friday evening. We went out with my wife and child and stuff. We had some dinner, came back, and then I was still in that state. And then I was doing the laundry, taking out, you know, drying socks and stuff. And suddenly it's like a veil lifted. Poof. And I realized I was standing, I was doing my stuff. At the same time, I knew more than I know I'm talking to you now. That was so clear and obvious that nothing ever happened. that I was never born, I would never die, nothing ever happened. And that became the overwhelming only reality. And there was this kind of no thing beyond being and non-being from that sort of dreamt the universe in a way in real time. And everything was just perfect as it is, even the most horrible things that we may experience had its part in the story, you know, a bit like a novel. If you don't have good and bad stuff, it's boring. You need some adventure, you know, like in a good James Bond movie. That's how it felt. But I was like in the state, you know, there was this unmanifest, unconditioned, beyond whatever, you know, like the way people describe the Tao or Plotinus would describe the One, you know. And I was that, and there was no I. You know, it's like, it seems absurd to try to describe that, but that's what it was. And it stayed for like some minutes. And then the most interesting actually is when we start to go down from there, because suddenly from this nothingness comes pure being. So there was a sense of beingness, like being a kind of metaphysical concept, but that feels as real, as solid as a wall of concrete. You know? That was just like being, and everything else was some kind of dream stuff, but there was just being. And from there, there was the projection of consciousness and whatever is within it. That was just one. There was no difference between this body and the things around me. It's just one. And then thoughts, and I would see how this consciousness sort of gets hypnotized by its own thoughts. And as we start to follow these thoughts, it would create a split between the part of reality that we see as me versus the part of reality that we see as other people, furniture, you know. And I could see how reality sort of reconstructs itself and suddenly feels material and solid, while everything felt transparent and immaterial. And as soon as this duality splits, everything looks real, solid. You know, it's a bit like we experience that when we wake up from a dream. The opposite way is like you may have experienced that, is that everything feels so real in the dream, like you drop a rock on your foot in a dream, it really hurts, you know, that type of thing. And as you wake up and this dream starts to dissolve from something that looks really real and solid, it starts to feel actually what we call dreamlike. So it was the same thing, but the other way around in real life, you know. And coming from there, there was this sense of, I know it would take a year to unpack all the insights within it, so I'm trying to summarize a few of them, but it felt like all religions actually describe some part of this, but none of them could describe the whole elephant, to take the metaphor of the Nirvana Sutra. Then there was no difference between meditation and everyday life. Like I would sit, this kind of zazen, I would be just around. It was the same thing. I would read koans, everything made full sense, and it became like a joke. And then I started laughing at myself because everything seemed so obvious, because you realize how this unmanifest, unconditioned is actually at the source, at the root of our own consciousness. So just this awareness coming out of our eyes, that's so common and ordinary. Actually, we overlook it because we don't know what's behind. But actually, you realize what's behind is this amazing thing, you know, that's no thing. So it feels so obvious that we can't understand how we have spent so many years missing something that's been just in front of our nose. And it reminded me of St. Augustine that says that the God that have looked for so long outside of me is more intimate that I am to my own self. Intimo intimo meo. That's beautifully said. So that's how it feels. And therefore, it's like a big joke. And this whole spiritual supermarket of religions and cults and teachers and gurus and lamas and whatnot felt like just like people selling water next to the river, it's like, because it feels so obvious, and simple. And then there's this joy and this feeling of like a weight has lifted. It feels like suddenly you lose like 40 kilos, you're like, and that's why I find it so beautiful in the Buddhist Pali Suttas when people try to ask the Buddha, like, what is nirvana and all that, and they try to, and he eludes all kind of metaphysical explanation. In one of them, he just says, it has the taste of freedom. I think it's something like that. It has the taste of freedom, He talks about the unconditioned, but he says it has the taste of freedom, and that's how it feels. And so anyway, that was that. And then it was a bit destabilizing because your sense of self sort of it doesn't completely vanish, but in my case, some people are different because I think the experience itself is more or less the same for everybody. Of course, people maybe see different things also according to the culture or the thing people are interested in. But the depth of how long the state remains can be different according to different people, depending on many things. We can maybe address this later because that's connected to how it unfolds later. But anyway, so for me, I stayed for quite a few days. What time is it? Yeah, I won't take too much of. So it stayed for quite a few days like that, and then it started to sort of contract and expand. So I would, because I went to like a business conference and stuff, and there were drinks and parties and things. So I would see I would sort of contract when I was into some kind of like active or stressful or kind of situation that required focus, interaction, or strategy. And then as soon as I would sit and do nothing, then poof, I would just expand and sort of merge into this, selfless state again. And it will shrink, condense and contract and expand and go like that. And then after and then emotions and thoughts just flow through you, but don't affect you so much. And the so-called negative emotions, like anxiety, fear, grief, they just feel like a kind of physical contraction. So I could feel my stomach or something like that's the kind of the animal body reacting, but it's not felt as such subjectively in that state. Okay, that's if I try to describe the phenomenology of how it feels. And that lasted for a few weeks. And then I think like most people, then life catches up, like I had to bring my son for some emergency surgery and stuff. So life catches up and that's part of it actually. But that's the drama for many people, you know. But I was not, since I was not, I had a job and all that, I was not like, I didn't look for this to start a career as a teacher or something, or to try to, I was not part of an organization. There was no, it was not as a kind of reward or receiving some robe or some title or some paper. So I didn't care. It was just my own quest, So anyway, for me, all this was fine. And I knew it would last because I was lucky to have people who had experienced very similar things, but just like 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, reminding you that we were at the time where all this sort of Dharma overground and Ingram people sort of it became a kind of nexus of like-minded people who had, in some cases, 20 or more years of practice, or some very hardcore young people within a few years got very deeply into that. So there was a kind of emulation, and we could see how it happened to other people. So, however, I didn't know what to do next, because nobody had a real clue. And everybody was trying to go in different direction. Maybe it's that, where people had different ideas. And then people like Kenneth Folk and Alan started their career. So they were starting to teach and to charge students. So, they didn't charge me anything. We were just like friends, back then. But it sort of kick-started their own career as a teacher, and they did great. And then I was interested to meet actually some people, because I like to it's not like I need some kind of validation, but I like to see whatever I do, I like to meet people who are really in a very specific tradition, because I'm not, I'm more like the kind of entrepreneurs who, instead of making a career in one big corporation, they just work as a salesperson for 2 years to learn about sales, and then they work in a bank to learn about finance, and so I do different things to learn different things, but I don't have the intention to become a holder of a particular tradition. So so the interesting thing is that I saw, by chance, because there was something at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland, close to where I live, Stuart Lax. I don't know if you know Stuart, but who was one of the old Zen guys in America, and who had been the assistant of Shengyan Shifu for 14 years in Queens in London. He was the first non-Chinese American student, or kind of assistant, more because he had already like 30-some years of Zen practice behind his belt with Maitsumi Roshi and all these people. And Stuart Lax is known for his critical articles about Zen, like coming down from Zen cloud and all that, but he has a deep personal practice behind that. And interestingly, he was one of the guys that 15 years before I had met on the first internet with AOL amongst these American people. So he was a kind of friend from back then. And we met in Lausanne, and he sort of drilled me for 2 hours the way he would do to people claiming to have some kind of Zen attainment, and asking all kind of tricky questions, the way they know how to do them. And then he said, yeah, that's what experience, that's what Shenyang experience, that's what it is, and he gave me some advice and stuff. And he said, okay, like Shenyang had some official students, because he wanted them to be mostly like Chinese or connected to have Chinese family or something, because he was more interested in having official students who would transmit the whole cultural heritage and but then he had some senior students who came to him because they were disappointed by all the scandals of some other teachers, because Shengyan was a real monk, never had some kind of affairs with women and stuff. So there are a few people who just found him as the real guy towards the end, but they already had all the experiences, and Shengyan didn't want to make them into his official sort of lineage holders, because he thought that they had their own tradition and stuff, It's just so Stuart said, yeah, if you want a paper, I'm not the right guy, because myself, it's been a private transmission, but as far as my concern, what you've experienced is what I had, and what Shengye had is the same thing, and then gave me some advice, some books to read, some places to visit in Korea and stuff. And I met Kenneth Folk also. We got a chance to meet in New York. That was great. And we had lunch together. Then I spent the whole afternoon with him. Then he teach me all these teaching style practices and encouraged me to teach back then. And then as I came back to my hotel room after Kenneth Folk, that guy is so powerful. My energy was so intense and strong. And suddenly, in my hotel room, I had this massive kundalini experience. So I felt this very strong energy. And then from Hatha Yoga and all these practices, I did what I was always told never to do, is to basically the practice of face breathing for 2 more. It's like you press the prana down and raise the apana up to Mula Bandha, so pressing the stomach down and raising the pelvic floor while holding the breath. And it creates a heat at the juncture point that awakens the kundalini. That's the way it works in Hatha Yoga, and that's what we practice in the Tibetan Tummo type practices. And suddenly I felt this warm, liquid energy rising in my spine and exploding in my head, like the whole thing blew away. And it was so intensely pleasurable and overwhelming that I had to sort of bring it down to the chest, the heart. And then I found myself in this complete non-dual state where that was blended and mixed with this feeling of love and joy and things. So everything felt completely transparent, non-dual, as if nothing had real texture. I mean, no solidity, and the sense of self was very kind of broad. And at the same time, this illusory world was full of love and joy, like the way things manifested was just manifesting some kind of divine love or something, So I started to understand like what those Tibetan guys are talking about when they say the union of bliss and emptiness. I thought maybe they must be talking about something like that, because that's how it feels. I mean, literally, And I found myself in that state for hours, and then I went to bed. And the next morning when I woke up, I was still into that. And then the next day I had this interview. What was his name? Jeffrey Martins? No.
From the Finder's Course, Jeffrey Martin, yeah.
Yeah, Jeffrey. So the course did not exist back then. He was interviewing people who were recommended as people who had this kind of non-dual experiences and stuff. So we met the next morning in New York at like 10 or something a.m. And he interviewed me with the tape, recorder thing. It was electronic for his PhD dissertation at between Harvard and University of, I think UCLA and Harvard or something. And for like 8 hours. So we talked like we're talking now, but like for 8 hours in a row in a cafe in New York. He's a great guy, by the way. But I don't know anything about what he did later. And but I find him very interesting. And so that was that part. And then I didn't really know what to do. I mean, we can fast forward a bit. In the years that came after, I didn't really know what to do, because you lose the interest, like you finally understood what you're trying to understand. You finally found what you've been trying to find. But then after, so what? Like you don't know exactly if there's a next stage or what to do, because it seems you can't go any deeper. So there must be some kind of embodiment, but you don't know how it works. We don't live in a culture where it's just obvious, or you have people, if I was born, I don't know, in Bhutan, maybe it would have been different. And yeah, so I said, okay, you become very fearless at this stage. So you say, okay, now I can just have fun, I just have fun. So there was I was working on articles or books, something with, and then I got some help from the second student of Alan Chapman, the American lady who had moved to Brazil with her husband, and she turned out to be a Santeria priestess. I didn't know that. And she was living in Rio. And since I had, as I told you, this kind of Brazilian ancestry on my mother's side, I was interested to understand this kind of Brazilian, traditions that seemed very mysterious to me. And she started to teach me everything she knew about Santeria and all these African traditions. And I found this absolutely so interesting, because this whole sort of African spirituality was something so alien to me and so impossible to understand before. And then herself as an anthropologist and as a fully initiated Santeria priestess who's been through this whole year-long process. It's very complicated, very demanding thing. And she taught me everything about working with these spirits and stuff. And I mean, that's something maybe people don't talk too much on your channel, but it's true. Like we had back then this idea that spirits, are more like maybe psychological archetypes or kind of projections of the mind, but they're not really real. And plus, this kind of chaos magic was even pushing this even further. But then when you are in contact with those African traditions and you have the spirits jumping from one person to another, and she eventually initiated me to Palo Mayombe at her place in New York, upstate New York, with Alan Chapman and all of these guys around. I mean, that was so powerful. You can't doubt it's not real. I mean, it's very intense, and you have these beings that you can communicate with them. That completely changed actually my understanding and perception of what spirits are and how real that can be. And this had nothing to do with the kind of woo-hoo type of Western occultism. I mean, that was real from traditions that came to the Caribbeans from West Africa through the slavery and stuff, and passing generations after generations. And it's so archaic. Like Palo Mayombe is something that's very animistic, it's very raw, and you can feel like if we imagine the religion of the Stone Age, that would be it in a way. It's based on the taking the power of different branch. Palo, is this branch, sticks, of different trees. So each tree is connected to a specific symbolic power, and then you have some bones and some feathers, and so you recreate a kind of macrocosmic universe with all these animistic items, and that thing becomes so charged with energy that you can feel it like some kind of powerful electromagnetic power plant or something. I mean, it's like, so that was very interesting, very interesting. My intention was not to really go into that as a kind of vocation or as a tradition for myself, because it's not my culture, it's not that, but I learned so much from it, and I'm so thankful. And I also learned actually the real thing that is actually helpful in any other tradition, because that's the way it works. Like those even in like Hindu or Buddhist traditions in Tibet and all that, the way they work with the spirits. I mean, the way the Tibetans present Buddhism to the West is strategic and political. They want to use the kind of science of the mind and psychology, and that's a smart idea to make it respectable and easy to understand, and co-opted by the sort of scientific community and stuff. But also, like my Japanese teacher, like they have the way they talk to foreigners, and what they believe is something different. And so that was a very interesting part, and lots of fun and great. I mean, these people are great. Like all the students of Alan's back then, I just loved them. And fast forward, so then for like more than 10 years, I become all these people, like they moved to different countries, they got married, they had kids, life is like that. So I lost track with these people. Myself, I became super involved with work. I started working like 10, 12 hours a day during the week and stuff, with different challenges and stuff. And after 10 years, so I tried different things. I couldn't fit within any kind of tradition. The problem also with this kind of awakening thing is that it's not that easy, because you lose the real purpose and target, and you can't really find, you still have a lot of things to learn, but you can't follow a teacher like you would before, you see, because that no one got something actually much deeper than you. It's just that they know more stuff in different things, like technical, but you can't anymore like worship somebody or want to follow somebody in the same way, because you don't feel like Dogen says when he came back from China, people ask him, what did you bring back and all that, and he says that he just found that the nose is vertical, the eyes are horizontal, and I won't be fooled by others. Like you won't be fooled by others. You know who's a real spiritual guy, who's not. But in a way, it's sad also because it's difficult to find a real teacher in the same way that you could have had before. You have instructors after or friends. So anyway, so it was a bit of a waste, like 10 years not knowing really what to do. But then what I've noticed after this powerful kundalini thing, after my meeting with Kenneth Folk, is that there was a kind of energetic development after that. So, and it takes years. I saw gradually to open this kind of grantis, they call it in Sanskrit, these knots, one behind the heart, one in the neck. I think the Taoists also have the same, they use the same locations for this jade pillow behind the neck and all that. And so gradually it's opened, and then it rewires your whole energy system and even your sexuality in a way, because it's not anymore something physical. The energy just rises, and therefore there's a kind of energetic exchange of energy that is felt as a kind of orgasmic, but it's nothing physical. So that's where I think we get a lot of this kind of tantric, of Taoist dual cultivation stuff. That's just becomes natural as the result of this energy change. So actually all these techniques of Hatha Yoga, they work when the system rewired itself. But before that, I think it's more a problem than something else, because it can send the energy where it's not supposed to go, or where it's blocked. So anyway, but then lost into meaningless stuff. And whenever things get meaningless for me, I always have this kind of crisis after a while of wasting my life. I think one of my biggest fear is that I just die and have not accomplished what I had to do, or wasting months. After this kind of awakening thing, the fear of death is not anymore a fear of, you don't have the fear of annihilation. Before, one of my motivation is the fear of extinction. It's not the fear of going to some hell realm or something after death. No, the idea of extinction, you just disappear forever, and there's nothing after. That was my existential fear. That disappears because you realize that what we are at the innermost core is unborn and therefore undying. And that becomes so clear and obvious that this fear disappears. And then there can still be the fear of suffering. If you're a medical doctor and you tell me that I have a cancer and I'm going to die in 6 months, I will freak out, But because you care about people, you're afraid of suffering, physically, this kind of thing. Yeah, sure. But the fear of extinction, not anymore. No. And also, so just to say that. But so my fear was more wasting my time, wasting my life, and that's always been a kind of big motivation for me. So at a point, this whole thing and the stress of work and taking after the COVID and stuff, you take the job of 2 or 3 people at the same time, and you end up, overloaded with stuff. And I was close to a burnout, and then it led to some complications at work and stuff. And a lot of anxiety, a lot of very difficult phase. And when I sort of took the decision to change job when it feels as if you could lose everything, and then also these things lead to some maybe couples or issues and things, because you insecurity, creates insecurity, worries and concerns on every level. So it impacts your family life, your everything. So it was a difficult time, and I used breath work to go through this. That's the only way actually to deal, I would say, with emotions when they get intense. A lot of techniques using all this mindfulness, that's easy for normal type of everyday type of emotional sort of concern and stuff. But when you get into some kind of very deep anxiety thing, the only way beside medication and sport and cardio and stuff is breath work. This kind of deep breathing. There's this guy Sandy on YouTube that's really good. The Breathe with Sandy. You know, I was following these videos and stuff. That really helped me a lot. So I do all this, and then we get to some other interesting thing. A new phase opens. Is that suddenly psychic senses start to open up. Like back then with this palo, you know, I could interact with spirits and stuff, but I could not like talk to them like I'm talking to you. And then suddenly this whole thing changed. I started to see things, to hear, to talk to them, to like different type of, and so just around that time I was into, and that's also, we had maybe some common, there were some of these first like online Tibetan Buddhist empowerment. So it was a way for me to get into these sort of advanced practices without having to join a group and to spend 15 years going through. So I received some of these empowerments and could finally sort of, because I like to do things by the rule. You know, I don't do things in a kind of, well, just taking a book and doing stuff when I'm not supposed to. So I was doing all these practices, but then I also received some Hindu tantric initiation, sort of. And that was more familiar to me. You know, like I love the techniques of Tibetan Buddhism, but as far as the deities are concerned, I don't have an emotional connection to them, and they are not seen also in the same way. And sometimes some are the same. It's like you take the Dasmavidya, the 10 great wisdom goddesses that are very commonly worshipped in the modern sort of contemporary tantric North Indian tradition, even sometimes. Some overlap, you know, like Vajrayogini, she's an aspect of Shinamasta, and then you have Tara, which is the Ugra Tara, or that in the Tibetan tradition is more like the blue Tara or something, one of the sort of rayful, fierce aspect of Tara. And then Kālī Mā, Hecate, you have, especially in the Nyingma tradition, you have Krodha Kālī practices and stuff. So they overlap, but then in India, they are like real. They are not like idams created by powerful Buddhas and thought forms. I mean, especially the way they are explained, I think, to Westerners, that's also echoes what we said before, because I think Tibetans see things differently, actually. But anyway, so I was doing these sort of Tibetan practices, but also sometimes those Hindu ones. And one evening, so I had this thing. Sorry, I need to get back slightly to the beginning. So I had this practice with an aspect of Tara, which is Nila Sarasvati, but has nothing to do with the Sarasvati of like the wife of Brahma in Hinduism. She's an aspect of Ugra Tara, and with the real sort of complex Hindu tantric practice with the nyasa, you know, like the mantra itself is a sort of encoded, and then you have to place like the rishi of the mantra, and each part is put into the placed into the body, and then you use like key parts of the mantras to empower your fingers, and then you place those energies into the bodies and stuff. So it's very complex. It's not like Tibetan Buddhism, like there's not much visualization, but it's more based around mantras and about activating the energy in the body and placing them in different energy centers in the body. And then you have also some kind of mental pujas, like offerings and stuff. And then you chant the mantra for like sometimes long time. And so I was doing these practices as sort of very formal and stuff. But then one day I thought, I think it was like on a dark moon or something, on a Friday or Saturday night. And I felt like offering red wine in a skull cup, like those real Tibetan, Nepalese skull up to Kālī Mā. And I don't know, I just felt like that. And so I did. And then I just did follow some complicated practice, just a very simple mantra, like Om, Krim, Kalikaye Nama, just very simple. And after, not the very long, complex that I know also. And after 3 malas, I was in the same room where I'm now. After 3 malas, suddenly she appears before me. But I mean, as I'm looking to you, like, of course, it was not material, it was not physical, but it felt the same way. And I'm used to like visions, but still it's not that solid. It's more, but here it was like this goddess standing like 2 meters in front of me, looking at me with the 4 arms and this, the 2 hands and the chopped head and stuff, and asking me like, what do you want? Like, you ask for a boon, now what is it? What do you want? And that's the way they describe the success of these tantric sadhanas. But I thought like this is like, like Indian people, they like to exaggerate stuff and of course the way they describe it make it feel as if it's real, like physical. Obviously it's not. You are into an outer state, but it feels so vivid that it's almost as if it's physical. Okay. And she talked to me in a way that I could hear also, like as if it was not like, sometimes it's like between your thoughts you hear with different voice, and that was really like loud. So what do you want? And quite like stern, like and there was like, whoa, like like, what do you ask? Because if you ask for something like, I want a new car, you get your new car, but then it's finished. So from books and stuff, I thought, like, you gotta be smart. I just ask for more devotion, so that's why. And then poof, she vanishes. As she came, she vanished. Poof. Okay. And I was like, wow, and then I wait to like a few hours, and I go to bed, and then she comes back. She comes back as I was going to sleep. And then Kālī, because I told you I had this early years as a late teenager into this Hindu environment. So I knew Kālī as this kind of motherly sort of dark figure, but still, they don't see us as a demon in India. She's the mother, she's Parvati, So, so she comes back, but this time she's not a mother. This time she comes as a lover. And for me, it was shocking. Like, I didn't know what to do with that, because you can feel that energy that's clearly not motherly, And so I won't go into too many details here on YouTube, but that was intense. And then, and she was fierce. She was in a fierce aspect, And suddenly she takes me to this sort of astral travel thing where I find myself flying in this kind of smashan, this funeral, cremation ground in some place, like could be like in Bengal or someplace, and with these wild animals, and everything is creepy and dark, and I don't see anything. I didn't feel the ash and whatever. And then I saw this kind of fire away from me, and I walked to this funeral pyre, and as I walk towards it, suddenly I see a figure behind it. So I try to see who's there. And I saw this young woman, like light blue, a little bit plumpy, with this big black eyes, and matted hair with one jata, and that's Kālī as in a peaceful form. And all smiling, all sweet, all like completely different from the fierce aspect. And suddenly, boom, she's back. We are back into my bedroom. And then she starts talking to me for like 1 hour, and talking about my life, talking about people I met, talking about what was the meaning of that, who was that person, what this happened, why she created total chaos in my life to reorganize it in her way, because I was like cut from my spiritual roots and stuff. and that was so touching, and she was so sweet. And that whole thing can sound completely crazy, but it was so real. And she's still like a close, like every time I have something, like not in this type of relationship, but every time sometimes I've been like attacked or something in this kind of sleep paralysis state, or whenever I call, like she's the only one that's like in split second, she's there and boom, like they're gone, and she comes like, oh. So she's like a bodyguard now, and so sweet. So yeah, but she brought me to some other of these dark goddesses, and that started a kind of crazy time, because at that time my psychic senses were really, I think whenever you go through some deep kind of shadow work, but forced by circumstances, like facing big adversity, and it somehow like opens up some, or releases some energy, and that has some impact. So my psychic senses were like super developed for at least 6 months. And I went through this, so it's still now, but not as sharp as it was back then. And I started to meet these other sort of dark goddesses, if you will, and getting into some real, like, not at all like this kind of magic, like using or asking stuff or pacts or even like, no, like relationship, as if like they know you, we have a common history, it goes back thousands of years ago, and they remind you of some past life, some event, something, and they try sometimes even to like shake you, like remember, like we know each other, this kind of thing. And then you'd start to develop this kind of relationship, like making a friend with somebody, or like reconnecting to somebody you forgot you have this, this person that or and that's been, in the beginning it feels a bit crazy, because you're aware of this kind of spiritual psychosis or this kind of thing, it's a real thing. So it's very that's why I think it's very useful to be like grounded, to have a job, a family or something, first of all, and then to find people, especially like I met gradually. Of course you get all kind of scammers or kind of badly intentioned people, but then gradually I find one or two people very good at channeling, that could actually channel the same and give me very clear messages that all made sense, said the same thing. So it's used like, we are into a kind of intersubjective thing. There's no way to test it objectively because it's nothing we can measure with scientific apparatus. The only thing we can do is to have different people who don't know, who have very little background info, and actually give you the same message or things that really make sense in the same order from the same. And gradually you see, yeah, it's like, it's real. I mean, at least it's shared. So I can go on for like talking for like 3 days about the details of all these stories, but this has been interesting. And then maybe fast forward, I don't know how much time we have for today, but there's something interesting, is that because I was trying to understand the meaning of all that, I was seeing that these sort of goddesses were sort of initiating me into something, because you see that when your inner experiences start to blend with some outer unlikely events, like real people start reaching out to you, and then you realize that there's this kind of connect. I mean, so many weird, unlikely things start to happen. You realize this is not normal. Like, you are going through something where the outside world gets mixed with your inner experiences and things. So I was like connecting to people, then you realize that was really strange, but incredible. I mean, that's sometimes the best years, My life is like that. It's sometimes within like 6 months, I live the most intense and crazy stuff, and then it gets boring for 10 years. So that was very interesting. But then I tried, for me, like, okay, but what's the meaning of all that? What's the meaning of all that? Because I'm not here for just entertainment. So I was trying to understand, and just between these two jobs, I had like 2 months, and I spent a month and a half, so a whole month in Bali and 2 weeks in China. And just before leaving Bali, like one day before, I could get in touch again with Alan Chapman, I had not seen for years. And we had a Zoom in the afternoon, just before my flight to Asia. And he tells me what happened in his case. And there was something very interesting, is that he went through something very similar, in the sense that somebody passed away in his family, very close, and he got into a very kind of depressed state, very dark. And then he told me in a kind of he didn't go into too much detail, but I think he talks about it on YouTube and some interviews, like he had this, suddenly he sort of met this sort of dark goddess that he called unnamed goddess, but he told me that she's more like Persephone, maybe this type of like, underworld type goddess. He had experiences with Hecate, was similar, and she sort of took him through the underworld, through the land of the damned, as he called it. So there is this whole initiation, a bit like the Greek Eleusis mysteries, when you're brought through the underground and you travel through hell before getting back in spring, back to life and to the surface. And so he went through this whole process, and so meeting with the dark goddess, going through this initiation in the underworld, and then when he came out of it, he was supposed to give a retreat in some place. I forgot what it was in Greece, but some kind of famous like holy place in Greece. And he had no idea what to teach. He wanted to cancel it, but it was too late, I think, because there was the plane and hotel and stuff for the people attending. But he told me, like, I had no idea what to tell these people. He says, I was completely blank. He had tried for 10 years to structure his teaching style and practice and things. And he had no idea, had nothing to say. And so he sat on a chair, or you can see this, I think there's some video when he starts. And then he started to, I would not say channel, but it was like inspired. And he started to give this teaching over 7 days that altogether became his book Magia, when it was typed down. And when you read the book, it's like it reads like beautiful poetry, and it's so deep in metaphysical and spiritual. I mean, and I can recognize some part of Alan Chapman's, like what he's been trying to. But he told me, like, frankly, he told me, Alex, I could never come up with that stuff alone. I mean, I tried for 10 years, so he was telling me, like, I met that goddess, and she gave me a beautiful baby, like what he was trying to do, that was the teachings, the book that came, finally through her inspiration. So anyway, so he tells me this whole story, very touching. And then the next day I leave to Bali, and or to China first and then to Bali. And then I don't know how much time we have, so maybe it can be another story, but you tell me. But in Bali, it was very interesting, because those people, the Balinese, I was at the time, in May, when there are not too many tourists, because it's between Easter and the sort of summer holidays, even if nowadays people travel all the time. So it was kind of okay. And when the local people see that you understand their culture and you're used to their type of, even if the practice is slightly different than in India and something, they take you as a kind of insider. And so they say, okay, I bring you to this temple in Feng, and then maybe I give you my phone number, and you come. There's a festival in our village tonight, and we invite you. And then so we went to the place. They give all this sarong and these special clothes and things, and so I was in this one of the first oldest temple in Bali called the Elephant Cave, I think, something like that. And it was a cave with yogis meditating inside before, and inside it's in Bali it's always like that. You have the big temple, like the tourists see, the kind of white place. That's not the interesting part. That's the what developed after. But sometimes you must have seen the same thing in other Asian countries. In Thailand, it's a lot. Like you have the real place where the yogis used to be, and then a temple develop out of it, a bit outside, and become a kind of whole like business sort of a commercial marketplace outside. So there I meet this lady, she and I make this kind of present offering to Bhairava, this sort of dark aspect of Shiva, which is often the Kshetrapala, the guardian of the land, you know. Like in Buddhism, they have the Dharmapala, the protector of the Dharma. In Hinduism, they're the Kshetrapal, the guardians of the field, of the land, you know. So my intuition was that you need to first go through Bhairava to get accepted into the spiritual Bali, you know. And then I'm invited to this village, and it's just like once a year or every 6 months. So it was quite lucky to be suddenly there in this huge festival. It's so beautiful, it's so nice. We were the only non-Balinese there, but then we had the right clothes, because if you're not dressed exactly like it is that particular year in that particular part of the village, you're not allowed to, they will kick you out. And there, every time I have the photos of it, there was the only black dog amongst 300 people and other dogs, only one black dog, always in front of me. And the black dog is the animal of Bhairava. And therefore, I took it as a sign that Bhairava accepted me with the black dog around, because many Indian tantrics, and I made some friends, like some real tantrics in India. So that's how they would see it. And I was communicating with them, by the way, on WhatsApp. And so I thought, okay, it's like starting, you know, well, like one of the first days. And then I started to have these. First of all, the people in Bali are very interesting, because you've got like some kind of like a barmaid, like juice bar type of thing, you know, and suddenly they start to talk things like about, like start to talk to my wife, like, oh, you're a very lucky woman and something. She says, why? What are you talking about, my husband? And she says, yeah, because last night I saw some light around, and you know, they feel stuff, and it's because they are very, especially the people from the countryside, they live in this kind of jungle, this very pure, simple life, and they're very psychic, they're very sensitive to things, and so you can talk suddenly about weird stuff with people, with a cab driver or some barmaid or someplace. So it's very interesting. And I was going there. So suddenly I had this dream, because I was trying to find a meaning, you know, like Alan found his meaning with his thing. So I was trying to find some meaning about all these experiences, what was going, what was the meaning of my life, what should I do? That was my big question. So I have this dream suddenly, and there is the procession, and I don't dream much. And there was a procession in honor of Parvati in Bali. So they all have this big, this big procession with this yellow color and stuff. And for Parvati, and then I wake up and I feel a spirit presence next to me. And I inquire, like, who are you? What's you know? And I understand it's Parvati. And we start talking, and I ask her like all these questions, like what's the meaning of all that? Am I going through some kind of initiation process? What I should do? What's the meaning? All these things, and she was there like, just sit back and relax, you know, like everything will unfold naturally. You don't need to stress about it. You don't need to, you know, just like relax and enjoy the show, and it will come. And I say, okay. And the same day, we were in a hotel, and there was some kind of free activity, like a yoga course and this and that. And the evening, there was a guy giving some kind of breathwork stuff. Since I love it, and because I discovered it during the time where I find it very useful, I went there, and I went in advance, because I thought if there are many people, I want to be, you know, to make sure it would not allow more than 6 people maybe to be there. And so I'm there slightly in advance, and we start talking, and he tells me like, yeah, actually I'm doing this, sometimes to in hotels, but actually I'm from a family of yogis, like third generation. My father, grandfather, they were like almost like full-time yogis in the center of Bali, close to the volcanoes and stuff. And we start talking a bit, and he said, "Can I look at your hand? Look at your palm?" And I said, "Yeah." So I give my palm, right palm. He looks at my hand. He says, "The other one." I give the other one. He looks, and he said, "Okay, after the course, you stay. We talk." Okay. So then we have like 45 minutes, 1 hour. It was really nice, by the way, this breathwork stuff. And then people leave, and we start talking. And so he said, "So tell me." And then we realized that we had the same experiences, like this kind of awakening, self-realization type of thing, and then the same kind of kundalini awakening stuff, and then the same unfolding and awakening of psychic senses. And then he tells me that he had this suddenly encounter with Durga, which in Bali is not, is very kind of witchy and dark, more like a kind of dark aspect of Kali in India. And he was very scared by that and all this. So I realized that Alan Chapman, this yogi in Bali, myself, we all went through the same stages in the same order, namely kind of non-dual awakening, enlightenment type experience, then this kind of kundalini thing, then this energy development, then this psychic stuff, then this encounter with this kind of dark goddess. And quite similar in all cases. So I see a real pattern across cultures and traditions, because like Alan Chapman is very much into the kind of Western occultism. This guy is from Bali, from a very traditional yogic tradition of like third generation. So I found it so interesting. And then he tells me that after that came something that, some event, he went to his father with a temple, and something happened, and suddenly he had this whole meaning of his purpose. Like he understood all his past life and all the purpose of his life, what he should do and all that. And he told me later that actually he's a kind of healer, which is different from his father and grandfather, who were pure yogis. And he received people like at 4 or 5 in the morning every day, and sleeps only 3-4 hours. And that he does all this for free for villages, and therefore he works in hotels from time to time to just make money to pay for the bills, because his real work is free, or people just pay with a little bit food or stuff. So we talk like that for like 40 minutes, and then he gives me this big hug and calling me brother. And at some point also he brought like all his spirits around me, and it was great. I could feel them, like packing around me and stuff. So and then he calls me like brother and give me a big hug, and just we go. So that's Bali. You have these kind of strange encounters like that. But it gave me the understanding that the whole thing followed a pattern. And later, actually through your channel, I listened to some of the people that have been deeply involved with Chinese internal alchemy. Like, what's his name? Marcus?
Oh, yes, I know who you're talking about.
Matthias Daly.
Yes, Matthias Daly. Mm-hmm.
Matthias Daly. So he also translated a very good book that's brilliant, because I had read those of Demo Michel, and also from my connection in China, it's the kind of thing I was kind of familiar with. But I mean, in China, it's very hard to find people who know about this, frankly speaking. I mean, that's why I admire them, and I'm because it's really hard to find people who actually know about this. You really need to look for them, and you don't find them in big cities. So I started reading some of these books, and I started to understand the logic, especially the one that Matthias translated, because actually it's from this kind of like complete reality school that has been pretty much influenced by Zen Chan during the Song Dynasty. And therefore, they sort of start with, if not some kind of Kensho, at least some kind of good, a bit like a Mahamudra, some kind of recognition of the nature of the mind as the sort of entrance into the practice. And then they focus on the lower dantian, which triggers the transformation of Jing into Qi, which is the Kundalini, yang Qi, you know, this kind of Kundalini rising and stuff, opening a channel. So actually I realized that process that Alan Chapman, Duncan also mentioned some kind of Kundalini, and then Kālī, encounter with Kālī also. So, you know, we all went through something very similar, actually. And it takes, and I remembered also, I don't know if you know about Nan Huai-Chin.
Yes.
You know, who, for other people who are not aware, he's passed away, I think, in the late 1990s or something, but who was one of the last, like, great Chinese masters who know, I mean, the guy, he's saying, like, people are impressed by the number of books I wrote, but he says, in reality, I tell you, I never wrote any book. It's just like people wrote notes of when I tell my stories, and the guy can just talk to, like, for like hours. Yeah, like these books, you know, these are great examples. Yeah, and the guy actually, he never wrote these books. He just like tells stories, and people take notes, and they turn it into books. And he was already like 80 or 90 years old with the memory, like he remembers all the name, all the details, all the quotes. I mean, and his life has been such a story. I mean, he's been taken studying martial art on Shan, and then the Japanese war started, and he was taken into the army, and then, I mean, it's a crazy life story. But the guy inherited, basically, to make it short, a kind of Zen, so Chan tradition, Mahamudra, Kaju, I think, tradition from Chinese, because for people also to understand, we call Tibetan Buddhism, but like the whole, especially like in Sichuan, the whole west part of China is pretty much, Tibetan Buddhism is their religion. Even in the Yuan dynasty, that was the state religion in the whole of China. So that's pretty, actually, it was one of the most popular form of Buddhism in China nowadays. And he was also, I think, he also had a lineage from a Longmen, the Dragon Gate Taoist tradition of internal alchemy and stuff. So he describes, like for Zen Chan, he says that after awakening, then there's a process of 12 years during which your whole energy system rewires itself. And so I find it interesting because I was in touch with Bill Beaudry, one of his American students, and we exchanged quite a lot before when he started writing the first books. And I always remember that amongst the people who knew what to do in Zen after the awakening, you know, in a very precise way, Nan Huai-Chin was one of the only one. And so I knew that it was supposed to unfold like that, but didn't know what to do practically. And anyway, so all this to say that between Alan Chapman, this guy in Bali, what I know from Nan Huai-Chin, what I discovered from reading the books of some of the people, the great people you interviewed on your channel, who were lucky to not only meet great people, but also took the effort to learn Chinese, which I'm ashamed I never, you know, beside a few words of some of the things that I can't speak like them. And it's a shame. I understand that actually it follows a kind of logical, natural pattern that we see across traditions, across cultures, across countries. So that's the kind of thing now I'm trying to understand more clearly. And one of the things I'm interested in now is also the Neoplatonist traditional theurgy of Iamblichus and those philosophers that became very popular around the 4th, 5th centuries, and then sort of disappeared, even if it remained within some form of Christian mysticism and theurgy. Or I mean, in the Orthodox Church, for example, there's a lot of things that are still like Pseudo-Dionysus is seen as Saint Dionysus, literally, like they don't see as some kind of apocryphal text from Neoplatonist, Christianized person. And so it survived in Islam. I mean, a lot of what I understand is that when the academy was closed, the Academy of Plato was one of the longest, like, lived for like 1,000 years, something, right? And or a bit less, but I mean and only closed around maybe the 8th or 9th century or something. And then those philosophers were invited in Persia, because one emperor of Persia wanted to create a kind of academy, and no, that was before Islam, so that was earlier, maybe around the 6th, 7th century or something. Anyway, they invited in Persia, they invited those Greek Roman philosophers to create a kind of university there, and at the time where Christian monks destroyed, that's how these authors describe it, destroyed the pagan temples in Greece and Rome and Europe. Some of these philosophers were invited in Persia, and that's not. I was talking the other day with a very interesting Turkish young man who's from a Sufi tradition in his family that goes back like 11 generations or something, from father to son. And he told me that all that comes from Iran, actually. All these traditions, they have their roots in Iran. Khorasan, which is close to Anatolia, and when the Mughal, this Mongolian people pushed them away from Iran, and they moved to Turkey and then to the whole Ottoman Empire later. But and they have a very deep connection with the Neoplatonist worldview. Same with Kabbalah, that's also an expression of the same thing. So my interest now, because I've always been interested to sort of, and Alan is going into this direction, we have like a parallel, and since it's more like his job, he has more time to involve into that. But our interest has always been to, in a way, revive the Western tradition of, I mean, not the kind of magic witchcraft thing, where people try to manifest stuff, but the real initiation, the real theurgy, and now maybe we can also finish with one of your last questions, is that I never wanted to, because I don't have a purpose to go public or to start to talk about this thing. That's my personal quest. And but then one of these sort of dark goddesses, which is Hecate, has been suddenly, she's very cool. She's the type of, she's not emotionally, very, but suddenly normally she's like, she steps back, she watches you from far a little bit, she's not really showing the way. She's like walking beside you, metaphorically, but also you can feel that in visions and stuff. But then suddenly she pushed me to say, now you have to talk. Now you have to come out, And that also was related to some kind of encounter of Persephone and in spring and all that. So there was a whole symbolism around it. I mean, I make it short, but for me it was meaningful that it was suddenly the time to sort of, okay, now we start to talk about that thing, and for what also will come next. And the next day, I received a message from you telling me, "Would you be interested to?" And I said, "Okay." That's why, that's why. Yeah, just within 24 hours. So yeah, so I'm getting back into these authors. And there are many things that no other tradition really explain. I think the Chinese are very good to explain how the connection between awareness, consciousness, energy, how the interaction between spirit and matter type of thing, this kind of missing part. It's very interesting to see how these alchemical texts explain this when we can finally understand them. Because when you read the real classic, it's just like our European alchemical text is like impossible to decipher the symbols if you don't know exactly how it works. But when you see, because I try to do these practices and I see it works on me, I mean, I didn't complete it, but I saw that at the beginning it just works as described. So I say, yeah, that's what it is. And then the Greek tradition, there's a lot of very interesting thing in these theurgies, like this whole embodiment process, because like Plotinus, this one way is to detach from matter and rise. That's the ascent, and that's what the Christian mystical tradition took. It's like the soul rises outside of matter and rises to merge with the divine. But the theurgy, more or less at the same time, it's the same, like different teachers of different parts of the sort of Roman Empire at that time have a different take on the same original dialogues of Plato, commentaries, because we say NeoPlatonism, but actually it's just Platonism, basically. It's the same thing. Their reading is more like how you invite spirit into matter and how you allow spirit or use your body and soul as a vessel so not only to infuse the soul and the body with spirit or the divine, the gods, but also how from there to sort of influence and radiate and have some kind of impact. And we can see, like, I find also in some of the videos of your guest, I saw some very interesting thing. There was a story, I forgot his name, this gentleman who reads Tibetan and told about Padmasambhava's strategic placement of stupas and statues in Tibet to take over local gods and turn it into a kind of vast mandala of Buddhist tantric energies. And I saw the same thing in Bali. And people understand that I understand their thing. It's like they have all these rivers that come down from these volcanoes and mountains, create a kind of like a spider web, a huge network, and they irrigate the main temples. So when you are in these small temples, you go to the main temple to take the holy water and you use it. So the water actually is the way by which they irrigate this kind of vast mandala of temples. And when you talk to them in private, they say, okay, from East Java, they tried to convert us to Islam for hundreds of years, and they never succeeded. They tried everything, they never succeeded. And why? Because we have this matrix, this network of energies that prevent any foreign energies from entering. So this notion of like sacred geography, the way religions take over others or resist others between Tibet, Bali, and we see the same thing happen in the West. I mean, the way Christianity took over by placing churches over pagan sanctuaries. And I find it fascinating to understand how this whole thing works. And it's a way to sort of reevaluate or understand in a better way, like what people like Padmasambhava did. It's pretty fascinating. It's something, some aspects like less talked about. Like people are interested in like getting this initiation, this empowerment, and learning this technique and this thing. But actually, when you see how it works, when you experience actually, because all these practices, they are like, like mimicking the real thing. Actually, like you visualize something that's actually happens spontaneously at some point. You which is interesting in a way, because it's the idea is that the same practice is actually the result that you're already doing as a practice. So it's the same thing actually you can do your whole life, just you go deeper and deeper into it. But anyway, so I'm not so much interested into fitting within one particular tradition or so, but it helps me to not only, helps me not only understand myself, but also understand our European culture, how things happen, how things can change in the future, as well as maybe also what would be needed in the future, because it's not only about oneself at some point. I think the biggest problem we have in the West is the loss of the soul. We developed a purely horizontal culture and tradition that has no real roots, no horizontal dimension. And I think that even the problem with some, I told you how much I love like Padmasambhava and all that, and how many years I spent in Buddhism, but unfortunately, I think the way like Buddhism is being valued and transmitted in the West is in a way just fits this kind of late capitalist machine that I think Slavoj Žižek is not that off when he sees it as the sort of the kind of religion co-opted by the late capitalist society to create a world where people are exploited and do meaningless stuff, and in a way where they are detached and they are mindful in their corporate jobs and things, and this idea, these kind of very deep metaphysical ideas of anatta, no self, emptiness, and all that. It has a real meaning that's very deep and all that matches real experiences of it, but it can be also misunderstood and co-opted in a way by this kind of post-human way of seeing human beings as kind of programmable nodes that can be engineered, programmed, merge with machines, and I think that there's a risk of losing our soul basically completely in a culture that is already soulless, I feel. So I think one of my purpose is to reintroduce also the notion of the soul, not as some eternal some kind of eternal atma that transmigrates. No, it's a construct, but it's the part of our being that lives through different states and that contains some kind of matrix. Because what happened to me is that also at some point you start to connect to people that are connected to you. You realize that you have some kind of past history that you can, I don't know if you've seen on Netflix this show Sense8, where people across the world are interrelated. Some of these things happen to me. You realize that some people living in some other continent are related to you. You can feel their emotion. So you start to realize that things are much more complex. You have some memories of past life, of stuff. And therefore, we're not into the purely materialistic side of life. That's also one part of my life. We're not into the pure, non-dual, abstract, super spiritual thing, neither. It's the in-between. It's the part of the soul that's individualized, that suffers, that experiences things, and that in a way, also I see spirituality in different way. It's not anymore escaping suffering. In a way also, it's like voluntarily choosing to live this human life, to actually experience suffering, and from that gain empathy, gain the ability to share people's, and that's why I think people don't understand also when they have this super great awakening, whatever experiences, and for sometimes weeks, sometimes months, sometimes even years, they feel completely on top of the world, and then they feel that they fall from grace and they're just back into some kind of horrible mess, and some like apologize, and they but they should understand actually it's great, what they're doing is great. It's like this kind of falling from grace is a way to sort of re-experience what it is to be a human, and to actually, this real compassion, this real empathy, this real love is actually to really, even like going through these very dark things like what I told about, like this kind of underworld Persephone type initiation, because I did that. Like, we go through this kind of very sort of dark stuff. I mean, I mentioned this tantric stuff, but I don't want to go into too much detail maybe today about this, but you become completely fearless, but also it allows you in a way to understand the complexity of the human mind, the human heart, and to better sort of relate to a kind of people without prejudice, without like judging, because you know that it's complex, and it's not about this notion of good and bad, or it's complicated, and you realize that from a kind of spiritual point of view, or some of these divine beings, they don't care so much about those petty things that most religions care about. They mostly care about being authentic and aligned. It's like, what you believe is what you say, is what you do. That's what they care about. They don't care about if you eat meat or drink alcohol or smoke a cigarette or live with a woman and you're not married, or they don't care about this shit. They care about how authentic we are, how aligned we are, how we integrate all the dark aspects of ourselves. This kind of shadow work thing is pretty much also their thing. And regardless of what type of being, it's a kind of common. I mean, I've known people who've been like working with like archangels for years. I've known others with like infernal beings, some with like Greek gods. And basically, for those people who really build a working relationship, not those who just like use to get stuff, they all tell you the same thing. Is like, what they care about is actually to be just like authentic, to be real, to be sincere, to be and to fully understand. Like, the highest they are, the more actually they value people who are souls that really go deep into the mess, into the pain, into the suffering, because that's how we gain this ability to relate to others, to develop love. And I think that love is, I mean, it sounds like a kind of hippie thing, and I'm a kind of Gen X punk guy, but in the end, it's also about love. It's true. I mean, it's a kind of force in the universe, and so that's the kind of thing I'm interested in. So I don't know if you have any specific questions about it, or if we...
Of course. Wow. Thank you very much. That was remarkable. Remarkable account.
I'm glad you find it interesting. Yeah. So I didn't go into all the details, because also some of these things are private also, or involve other people. So, but But if you're interested later, we can go deeper into some parts or some.
I am very interested, yes, of course. So in that case, I would propose a sequel.
Oh, sure, that would be great.
Great. I have many questions about what you've said, but I think this episode stands by itself as your, if you want, initial account of your path. And I think we should leave it just like that, just to stand by itself, and then meet again to go into details. And of course, I have very many questions about actually each stage of that journey. We can begin to look through it all in detail and look at some of those themes. What do you think?
Fascinating. Yeah, it's a good idea. It's great. And I've told you this in the past, but I'm always, that I admire you so much for your deep knowledge, for the time you take to also prepare somebody like somebody like me, I didn't publish books and stuff, but when people do, you take the time to read their books, to study their biography, to sometimes find things about them that doesn't appear anywhere, on the internet or somewhere, and the way that you're so respectful, so let people talk. It's rare. I think we're so used to this sort of journalist or people who try to aggressively corner people, push them to say something. And your genuine interest and it's very valuable. And I've been watching your videos and from your channel for so long now, and so I'm very happy to somehow become one of these guys.
Thank you very much for your kind words, and thank you for this remarkable account.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.